Really?
Yeah, I worry. I mean, little things bother me. I'm a worrier. I mean, little insignificant details. I lose my appetite. I can't eat. You know, there's only one thing that I'm not clear about. Actually, there is one thing. One other thing. One more question, sir. About those sacks of gold.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Grotto in the Tar Pit. Tonight's guest is a Christian apologist and talk radio show host who received an MA in Philosophy of Religion and Ethics from Talbot School of Theology, also an MA in Christian Apologetics from Simon Greenleaf School of Law. In 1993, he founded Stand to Reason, an organization dedicated to training those supporting his Christian views to defend their faith with knowledge, wisdom, and character. Stand to Reason produces a weekly radio program, audio podcasts, articles, and video materials. Stand to Reason sponsors mission trips in which students encounter those with opposing views, including Mormons and atheists. His book, Tactics, a game plan for discussing Christian convictions, was cited as a must-read on how to share your Christian beliefs and defend Christianity. He is known particularly for what he calls the Columbo tactic, named after the fictional detective of always asking one more question. Greg Koukl, how you doing today?
I'm chuckling because I just saw your cutaways there to Lieutenant Columbo doing his thing, and it's just so classic the way he operates. But it also is a fabulous kind of approach to engaging people who are challenging us on our own convictions. So I'm glad you ran those clips.
Yeah, I found it funny too. It's like, oh, just one more thing. Let me dig a little bit deeper on what you're doing.
Yeah. There's one other thing that bothers me here.
Yeah.
You know, just,
I can't sleep at night.
Yeah.
So,
That's so great.
well, one of the big reasons that I wanted to bring you on is because apologetics is something that's always, caught my eye, and I wanted to learn more about it. Can you give me a brief definition of what apologetics is?
Yeah, it's kind of an unfortunate word, Sergio, because it sounds like we're apologizing in the sense of saying we're sorry. But the word actually comes from a Greek word, apologia, which is in First Peter chapter 3, verse 16, I think. And it says that we should sanctify Christ as Lord in our hearts, always being ready to make a defense for everyone who asks us to give an answer for the hope that's within us. Now, that word defense in the translation comes from that word, the Greek word apologio, which is in the original text. And it just means to make a defense, to make a case in favor of something. So there can be an apologist for all kinds of things. There are apologists for atheism, Richard Dawkins, for example, or Alex
Islamic apologists,
O'Connor, or somebody, and people that you might know who are the outspoken atheists, and they're making their case for atheism. But usually the word apologetics is applied to Christians making their case for the truth of Christianity, principally because it's one of the few worldviews, the few stories of reality, as it were, that can actually make a case for the truthfulness of the account of reality. And most religions don't even make an attempt at that. It's just believe it or not kind of thing, where Christianity can do this. And so the first apologists, well, actually, Jesus was an apologist, and the Apostle Paul was an apologist, and all the writers of the New Testament, you see them making the case or defending Christianity. Paul says, John, at the end of his gospel, it's interesting how he characterizes his reason for writing the gospel. And this is right after the Doubting Thomas scene in John chapter 20. And John says this, he says, many other works or signs and wonders, miracles, Jesus performed that are not written in this book. In other words, he later says there's so many things that Jesus did, it would fill all the libraries of the world. But he says, these things I've chosen. In other words, the 7 miracles that he has included in his account of Jesus' life. It's interesting how he puts it. These things I've included so that you will believe. So that you will believe what? That Jesus Christ is the Christ, the Son of God, 2 things, the Messiah and God come down, and in believing have life in his name. So there you see it. There's apologetics in action. Paul, or rather, John is saying the reason I wrote my whole account of Jesus' life is to give you reasons to take Jesus' claims seriously and to have confidence that he was right. And if you put your confidence in him as the Messiah and as the Son of God, then you're going to have eternal life as a process. So that's all connected together. It's the evidence that's given that is the foundation for our trust in Jesus. And when we trust in Jesus, this gains us eternal life that he gives us. So that's how it's kind of all tied together. Many other passages in the New Testament make this point. Acts chapter 1, Luke there records that Jesus presented himself with many convincing proofs. That's the language Luke uses in Acts chapter 1. And then later on in the book of Acts, like 17 or 18, you see Paul going, as was his custom, reasoning, and some were persuaded, whether it's in the synagogue or later on in Mars Hill. He is reasoning with them, giving them reasons to take seriously this message. And consequently, people were persuaded. It's funny for me, Serge, when people say, "Oh, nobody's ever convinced about God or Christianity by argument." And my response is, yes, they are. It happens all the time, and it happens in the scriptures. We see the record of it there. Many were persuaded, for example. And many of my colleagues were Lee Strobel, for example. Maybe your listeners will know him, or J. Warner Wallace, both who are friends, and we work together a lot. And I know in their background, it was evidence that made a huge difference for them in believing and becoming Christians and followers of Christ. And by the way, this is to stand in contrast with the way almost every single atheist right now is writing with regards to Christianity and faith, because what they characterize faith as is believing things that you have no good reason to believe in, belief without evidence. Now, that may be their definition, but it isn't the biblical definition of it, and it's not been Christianity's definition for 2,000 years. Unfortunately, there are a lot of Christians who have fallen into that error of thinking that, well, you got faith over here and you got knowledge over here. And if you got all this evidence for Christianity, for the truth of it that you're presenting in your apologetics, then they say, where is room for faith? Notice how they put faith over here and evidence and knowledge over here, and never the two shall meet. Yeah. In fact, biblically, they do meet. They're connected at the hip. We have evidence that allows us to put an intelligent step of trust, not leap of faith, but an intelligent step of trust in Jesus. And that's the way it's characterized in Scripture. That's maybe a thumbnail sketch then of what apologetics is all about.
Yeah, like to me, I'm not sure if you attribute any or you subscribe to any of the findings of Ron Wyatt, but I do. And to me, myself, Ron Wyatt.
I don't know that name. Ron Wyatt?
Ron Wyatt, yeah.
Okay.
He's thought to have discovered Noah's Ark and the Red Sea crossing, the altar to the golden calf.
Oh, okay, an archaeologist, right?
Yeah,
okay.
And it's the same thing. To me, seeing that only strengthens my faith.
Yeah, so, right.
Yeah,
of course. Those are the kinds of things that people who specialize in this, and they're different areas. I'm more of a generalist. My background is in, actually I have a master's degree in philosophy as well as apologetics in general. And so that allows me to kind of parse out some issues that others aren't able to do just because I have training in that. But guys with training in archaeology or training in science, they are doing apologetics, defending Christianity in a different arena. And we've got lots of people. I mentioned too a moment ago, J. Warner Wallace and Lee Strobel, but there's a whole bunch more. Frank Turek, Sean McDowell, and Josh before him, his dad. There's so many people that are doing a great job bringing forth the evidence for all aspects of the Christian worldview. One of my mentors was J.P. Moreland, the philosopher, and I took an MA under him in philosophy. So there's lots of people out there that are making the case in a wide variety of areas because Christianity is challenged, attacked in a wide variety of areas as well. And so it's great that we have such a deep bench that the body of Christ can take advantage of in a good way now. When I started many years ago, I've been a Christian 52 years. I became a Christian during the Jesus movement in the 70s. And there weren't many
Is
people
that with
that dropped
the Pirates Bay and Lonnie Frisbee?
Yeah, Lonnie Frisbee, sure. Yeah. If you saw the movie,
Jesus Revolution.
Yeah, Jesus Revolution, then you've got Chuck Smith and the Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, which is the kind of the epicenter. Lonnie Frisbee was one of the players, but there were lots of players back then. People were making a difference, and then lots and lots of people became Christians during the Jesus movement. Many people that you probably read now, and maybe some of your listeners, viewers, read.
Who's the guy? The guy from New Beginnings. Forget his name. Oh, never mind. Go ahead.
Look, I have a lot of moments like that. It's the
Greg Laurie. Greg Laurie.
Greg Laurie. Sure. Yeah. Well, he was part of the young crowd over there under Chuck Smith during the Jesus movement when it first started. Mike McIntosh was in that group. Greg Laurie. And Tom Stipe. These were all young men. I mean, my age, basically. My age back then too. We were just youngsters in our early 20s, and they were part of that whole thing, giving concerts and doing presentations and seeing people come to Christ. And Greg Laurie, of course, has been, he's had his own enterprise, very successful in the Lord, making a difference. But he came out of that whole movement as well, right?
How'd you get brought into it?
Well, I was actually raised Roman Catholic, and I was born in 1950, so I was raised in the 50s and early 60s. And when I, was old enough to start thinking for myself, that's when I abandoned Catholicism, which I was never deeply committed to. It was just kind of a habit, and my family was Catholic, and so we just did that, and that was my religion because that's what I was raised in.
Are there some things that really stuck out to you that you were like, oh, that's wrong?
Well, not at that point. It was just... It just was what I did. I didn't like going to church on Sunday and all the other days I had to do, and a bunch of stuff that I didn't care for. But what I've learned since then is you don't find a religion you like. That's a mistake. You got to find what's true. In any event, at that point, I just dismissed it all as not true and went on my way. And over the years, I'd have people talk with me about Christianity after I had left Roman Catholicism, and I thought, oh, well, I've been there, done that, and I'm not interested because look at when you're 18, 19, 20 years old during the counterculture revolution of the 60s, free love and all that. That's what it was called then. Now it's commonplace, hooking up and that kind of stuff. But back then it was kind of new. And when you're that age and a young man, you don't want to be thinking about purity and religion and God and that kind of stuff. So I just went my own way for about 5 years. And then my younger brother became a Christian during the Jesus movement, and he started telling me about Jesus. Now, I'm the only one of 5 kids to go to university, and I got my bachelor's and 2 master's degrees. But at the time, I just thought I was too smart for that. That was for losers and idiots and losers and socially unacceptable people.
What were you going to school before that? Because
you're
a Biola boy.
No. That Biola came much later, but in the 90s, and I became a Christian.
Isn't Talbot part of Biola though?
Yes, Talbot. Yes, that's right. Talbot is the graduate school at Biola University. But I went to Northern Illinois University. Then I went to Michigan State. I was in a pre-law program in honors college there. And then basically I was following my girlfriend around the country. She moved to the West Coast, my high school sweetheart. And so I moved to the West Coast. I started going to UCLA. And that's when I became a Christian. And then I eventually went to Azusa Pacific College at the time, got a bachelor's degree, and then ended up, as time went on, with my other degrees. But I was just, I just thought I was too smart for Christianity. And yet my brother was out in the West Coast and I was out in the West Coast. We were both here at the same time. We talked more often. And I don't know how to explain it, Sergio. Many of my friends became Christians in virtue of the apologetics they engaged with, like I mentioned earlier. But in my case, it wasn't apologetics that brought me to Christ. All I can say is I just got wore down by the gospel. My brother would be telling me the truth. And the truth that I recall that made the most difference for me was the truth about the grace of God. Because as a Roman Catholic, you never have any confidence that you're going to heaven. You don't know that, because it is essentially de facto. In other words, in actual practice, it's a works-based salvation religion. And even though Jesus is in the mix, and they have the right ideas about Jesus and the Trinity and about the Bible and stuff like that, by and large, I never really understood the grace of God. And I was always afraid of death, because you never know if are you going to heaven or hell, kind of thing. And of course, I brushed that off for about 5 years, and I didn't think about it much until my brother was talking to me quite a bit about Jesus. And then it just all began to seep in. And all I could say is I just came to a point in my life and my understanding, as I asked questions, etc., of just really being convinced that what he is telling me about Jesus and salvation and God and sin and grace and everything was actually true. Now, I had a lot of questions that I'd asked before that I didn't get answers to in the past, and I still hadn't gotten answers to. I mean, abortion and evolution and premarital sex, and I didn't have any of that resolved. But one thing that was just clear in my mind is that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And so I committed my life to Christ based on that conviction. And I ended up learning apologetics afterwards, as people were asking me, and I was curious to know the answers too. And then it became an area that I was really interested in, and I ended up focusing in on that over the years.
Well, all that pre-law must have got you ready for it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, the good news is only good news because the bad news is bad news. And the bad news is really bad. That's what makes the good news really good. And so my background in kind of the legalism, I certainly understood that part, but I never really understood that I could actually be forgiven. That would be like past tense forgiven. You didn't just get forgiven for each sin as you're committing, as you're going to confession on, Friday nights or whatever it happens to be. And then when you walk out and see a good looking girl, then it's all over with. You got to go back in again, that idea. I never realized I could have, as a current possession, eternal life. It's what I have now, not something I'll get maybe in the future. I have it now because of Jesus and the grace of God. And that was a thing that was totally transforming to me.
Wow. So I wanted to ask you, and one of the things you were saying is a lot of it is like what led you away is that you were doing you, and you wanted to be out there in the world. You were having fun. You didn't want to mess with any of that. In today's society, do you think there's a lot of people that deep down in their heart actually really know there's a God, but it really messes up with their whole, I'm sinning right now.
Yeah.
So in their mind, they give into the delusion of there's no God.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of people, or at least acting like there's no God. And they might, the number of atheists, I mean, it's always rather small, less than 5%, I think, of the population of this country, at least, maybe 3%. But that's the people who would actively identify as atheists. But a lot of people live as practical atheists. In other words, they're living as if there is no one looking over their shoulder and there's no accountability. And maybe the looking over the shoulder isn't the right way to put it. That's the most negative way to put it. The fact is that God is always there. We don't escape him. He sees everything, and he has a standard that we ought to be living by, and we don't live by that, nor do we want to. I certainly didn't want to in the 60s. I wanted to do my own thing. And you mentioned like a you do you kind of thing, and that's the ethic of this era right now, the number one guiding ethic. Here's what's ironic about that, though, Sergio, and a lot of people don't think about this. They want to live however they want to live, but they don't want other people to live towards them however the other people want to live. In other words, they don't want to have any moral restrictions on their own lives, but they want other people to behave towards them. And when they don't,
I heard, there's a saying where, like, a cheater believes there's nothing wrong with cheating until they get cheated on.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And I remember there's a Bullets Over Broadway. This was a stage play that they made into a movie. And this was about, there was a TV director and a young man. Matthew Broderick played the young man. And the TV or the movie director was trying to educate Broderick. Yeah, we have our own ethics, and there's no ethics for us. We make up our own ethics. And then, so Matthew Broderick later in the movie ends up sleeping with that guy's wife. And he gets really angry at him. And Matthew Broderick said, "Hey, I thought you said we just live by our own rules." And he said, "I didn't mean you, I meant me," like that. And that's exactly the point that you're making, Serge. And this is something you see in people's lives. They certainly don't want any restraints on their own lives. And I think then to say that there is no God, and this goes to your earlier point, becomes very convenient, because then there is no God to tell them what to do. This is exactly the way I was during that period. I did not want anybody telling me what I could do with my life. I wanted to go where I wanted to go, live how I wanted to live, sleep with whoever I wanted to sleep with. That's who are you to say, kind of thing. But the irony is, during that time, I was marching against the war in Vietnam. Why? Well, it was an immoral war. Wait a minute. How could it be the case that there is no morality when it comes to my behavior, but there is morality when it comes to the government's behavior? That was a contradiction. And I actually was aware of that at the time. And I thought, hey, that doesn't actually work. But I was willing to live with that tension because, again, I wanted to do what I want to do. And I think that's the way most young people are today.
And you think that's an example of a reprobate mind, or what will turn into a reprobate mind?
Well, I think we all have pretty much a reprobate mind to begin with. We're all operating from a fallen nature. And as we are rejecting the truth of God, that's obvious to everyone. This is what Paul talks about in Romans 1. We suppress the truth in unrighteousness. It's obvious in this. You mentioned, do you think deep down in their heart everybody believes in God? And I think, yeah, I do think on a certain level, they're not always consciously aware of it, but they do. And this is what Paul's talking about. But what happens is they don't want that. So they, as Paul puts it, suppress the truth. They're like pressing it down because they're unrighteous. And this is not just an evidence of a reprobate mind, but it adds to more reprobateness, I guess. I don't know if that's a word. Excuse me. But Paul talks about God giving them over. Okay, you want to do your own thing? I'm just going to let you go and do your own thing. And that certainly is a factor.
Okay. So you believe that every Christian, every believer in Yeshua should know apologetics?
I want to be careful how I say this. I think it's really an important practical detail in a Christian's life. And it's evidenced with every writer in the New Testament, whether it's Jesus or whether it's Luke reporting on the early Christians, certainly Paul and Peter, all of them. They are demonstrating, they are speaking the truth, and they are given reasons why it ought to be believed. So in that sense, I think every Christian ought to. The reason I pause is I don't think that apologetics should be maybe the main emphasis of everyone's life. I mean, that's some people, yes, like me, maybe you, but we're here to help other people out. But certainly to be more schooled in apologetics and a tactical tool means of maneuvering, and you showed Columbo there earlier. We'll talk about him and what we can learn from him and how he maneuvered. I think that this is really important for every Christian. And the reason is twofold. One is it will help them when they are under attack by other skeptics, but it will also help them when they face the toughest skeptic they will ever face. And that's going to be themselves. We're the toughest skeptic we'll ever face. And when we're all alone and we're thinking about things and maybe hardship befalls us and we think, oh man, why did that happen? Where was God when this happened to me or this happened to somebody I care about? Where was God? Well, maybe there is no God. and maybe I'm just wishing on a star and I'm making all this up and this is a big mistake. Well, it's not unusual for people to have doubts. Everybody has doubts. But if you don't have a way to address the doubts in a substantive fashion, those doubts may not go away, and they may end up shipwrecking people's trust in the Lord. And that's why apologetics are going to be, in a sense, personally and practically important to every Christian. So I think every Christian ought to have some understanding that Christianity is based on it's based on a person, Jesus, but the truth of it is based on certain facts of the world and facts of history, not just on teaching of Jesus, but on details about his life and what he did, the person and the work of Christ. And if you don't have some good reason to be confident that those things are actually true, it's going to be really hard to survive, especially in this day and age.
In one of my prior interviews, I was talking to somebody who told me that they know of so many people that have lost their faith because they were confronted with a Muslim or an atheist that hit them with these questions and stuff like that they had no answer for, and they just crumbled and lost their faith.
Yeah.
And which is why I think it's important to know the flip side of the coin too, which is like even if you're Christian, know what the Muslim is going to ask you or how he's going to try to break down your faith.
Yeah.
Is that something you try to do as well?
Well, that's certainly important, no matter who it is we're talking to. Each particular challenger, from whatever group they're in, they usually have a certain type of challenge. Like Muslims are going to challenge the authority of Scripture. They're going to say, well, your book has been corrupted. That's their favorite objection and challenge to the New Testament. It's been corrupted. It's been changed. It's not what the original authors actually wrote. And they're also going to take exception with the notion of the Trinity, that God became a man in the person of Jesus, and still God was kind of in heaven and on earth at the same time. Well, that makes sense in terms of the Trinity. The Father's in heaven and the Son is on earth, in having taken on humanity, and the Holy Spirit's, working also. But they don't like that. They think that's three gods because they don't understand the Christian view. But a lot of Christians don't understand the Christian view either. So if you're going to deal with Muslims, then those are two areas you're going to have to be able to deal with, or else you're not going to be able to get their attention by the truth. By the way, it's interesting with Muslims, a lot of times, because they're such a tough nut to crack, and it's not just because of their own theology against Christian theology. Muslims characteristically like talking about religion. You want to talk to a Muslim, he'll talk to you all day about religion. So it isn't like others who don't want to talk or whatever, but they're happy to talk about it characteristically. But one of the things you notice with Muslims is not only do they have those objections, but it also, to go from Islam to Christianity for a Muslim, this is not just a big theological jump, it's a huge sociological jump. And what I mean by that is, Charlie Kirk got killed a couple of months ago, I think largely because he was a Christian in the views that he held. All right. That's very rare in this country, but it is not rare in other countries, like in Africa and in the Middle East, and in other where Islam is reigning, then lots of Christians are killed. So if you want to go from Islam to Christianity, you may be sacrificing your life. And so because that's such a big jump, I don't know. I'm presuming on the because here, but the fact is that a whole bunch of people who were Muslim and now are Christian have some supernatural element in their life, dreams or visions or appearances by Jesus that were part of what persuaded them to become Christians against their theology and in spite of the sociological danger that they encounter. They are so convinced of the truth of Christianity, they're willing to put their lives on the line in a way a lot of Christians in this country are not willing to do. So those are the kinds of things. Different groups are going to have different kinds of objections. You talk to an atheist. I was on a podcast a couple of months ago with Alex O'Connor. He's probably the best known atheist in the world, certainly by Gen Zers, and he had his particular brand of challenges and objections. Different people are going to have different objections, so it just depends on who you talk to.
Yeah, one of the quote that I seen a few months ago, and I totally love what it said. It's why I know that Christianity is true, and that what the apostles were proclaiming was truth, is that they all died for their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it came to Watergate, there was 12 people too, and they all broke right away within a year or two.
Yeah. Well, there is an argument there, but I think it needs to be carefully nuanced. So here's the way I would put it. In what almost 25 years ago, 9/11. Were you alive at 9/11? I'm trying to remember. Yeah. You were. Do you remember that? Were you old enough to remember it?
Oh yeah, it was my senior year of high school.
Oh, okay.
I walked in to see the door, and everybody's looking at the TV screen.
Yeah.
Wrap it up. We're all going home.
All right. Well, you're older than you look, so that's probably a good thing. But you have to be 25, 26, 27 years old, even to have any recollection at all, even as a youngster or young kid, of that event. But in that event, you had a bunch of terrorists who died for what they believed in, but what they believed in was false. Now, so here is the key thing about the apostles, especially the original 11 that were left after Judas was killed, and certainly the others that saw, and there were many that saw Jesus. Okay, there were 400 at one point that Paul said witnessed the resurrected Christ. If those people were lying,
I mean, he was around for a while. He wasn't just around for one day. He was around for
40 days.
Right?
Yeah, that's right, and met and saw a lot of people. But the charge is that maybe, for example, the disciples stole the body. That's why there was no body in the tomb, or they were making this up, and for whatever reason. But the key here is that if they were making it up, they were the ones that they knew that it wasn't true, that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Lots of people will die for a lie, like those Muslim terrorists on 9/11. But how many people are going to die for a lie that they know is a lie? And that's the key here. These disciples would have known that Jesus did not rise from the dead, yet they confessed that they saw him and were willing to put their lives on the line. What this shows you is that he weren't lying. Now, they could have been mistaken in principle. Maybe they were having a hallucination or something, but hallucinations don't happen like what we see in there.
Not the 400 or 500 people over 40 days.
No. That's you're right. It's just
you hear about mass hallucinations, but not like that. Not that long and not that many people.
Yeah, I'm not even sure about the mass hallucinations, because hallucinations happen in your head. You can't have the same hallucination happening inside the head of 400 people at the same time. That's not a good explanation for what happened. Probably the best explanation is the ones that the disciples gave. He who is dead is now alive, to which we are all witnesses. So that's the key. It's not just that they died for a lie. It's they died for a lie knowing that it was a lie. And that's what you don't see happen.
So one of the reasons that I brought you on is I myself, I with this whole climate of Charlie Kirk and stuff like that, I think what Charlie Kirk and what people like Clef are doing is an amazing work of God. And you can see God working through these people and affecting the young people. And so many people coming to God. It's amazing. It's a miracle in itself.
Right.
That I myself, I want to be able to, if it has to do outreach like that. So I want to do this from an intellectual point of view, so I know what to expect. I don't want to just jump out there and look like a fool. So before we get into your tactics, can you tell us some of the tactics that the opposition will use? Like, I know two of them, like one of them, if they really don't have an argument with what you're speaking, if they have no legs to stand on, then they attack your character. They'll
Yeah.
attack you.
Yeah.
Or
Exactly.
also they'll bombard you with like 500 questions and then expect
Yeah.
you to answer it all.
They overwhelm. That's right. Those are good observations. And I've been in situations like that. In fact, the first one, it's actually an informal fallacy, and it's called ad hominem. And all that Latin word means is to the man. And to put it most simply, people who commit that fallacy and that's their tactic, is instead of dealing with the issue, they attack the person. So, for example, let's just say I was talking about, say, same-sex marriage or something, or gender, dysphoria, or whatever, and somebody said, "Well, you're bigoted, or you're just intolerant." Now, notice how, if we're talking about the things I just mentioned, and then they say, "Well, that's a bigoted view. That's an intolerant view." Notice how they've changed the subject. Let's say same-sex marriage. We were talking about same-sex marriage, or whether homosexuality is a good thing or a bad thing. We were talking about that. Maybe it's an open question. We can have the discussion. But when they go and they say, "Well, you're a bigot," or "You're hateful," or "You're whatever," now they change the subject from, say, homosexuality to my character. That's the switch. We're no longer talking about the issue anymore. They've dragged us off of the issue, and we're not discussing the issue anymore. We're just talking about how bad of a person I am. Now, think about this for a moment. If somebody said, "Well, you're intolerant," or "You're a bigot," and I said back to them, "Well, you're ugly," which
It might be true.
it might be true. I wouldn't say it, because not only would it be bad manners, but it would be irrelevant. Because do you think ugly people can still have a point of view that's accurate? Sure. That's not, one's not connected to the other. And the same is true about the so-called intolerant, bigoted, arrogant, hateful person. Even if they have all of those character flaws, they still could be right on the issue. And so when somebody is attacking us instead of the issue, you know that they've made a mistake. And it's fair to call them out on that. Like, you might ask the question, and notice there's going to be a lot of questions that I use to deal with this, just like we saw Columbo. You can ask the question, why did you change the subject? What do you mean, why did I change the subject? Well, we were talking about same-sex marriage, and now we're talking about my personality. Why did you change? Well, because you're arrogant. Well, maybe, or you're bigoted or whatever. Well, maybe I can, but what does that have to do with whether or not homosexuality is right or wrong? See, that's the question to get them back on the point, but it's a question. Now they've got to say, well, they're not going to be able to defend it at that point, because there is no defense. You pointed out the change of subject. Now, they may not want to be more cooperative with you, but at least you haven't let them get away with a tactical maneuver that's not appropriate in those circumstances. And incidentally, if I'm going to raise this issue, I'm going to do it in a nice way. I'm not going to be nasty to them. I'm not going to say you're ugly, or anything like that, or you're stupid too, or whatever. You're hating me right now, or whatever. I'm going to just ask, why did you change the subject? Well, we were talking about this. Now we're talking about that. Let's talk about the issue. Maybe you're right. And I was on a TV show once, and this very thing happened with 3 other people across the table from me. They're all coming after me. And I made this observation. I said, we started out talking about one thing, and now we're talking about me. I said, so I'm a bad person, is basically what you're saying. So why don't I just agree with you? Okay, I agree that I'm intolerant, I'm hateful, I'm whatever, bigoted, I'm bad. Okay, now we all agree that I'm bad. Now, can we get back to this topic? Kind of thing. But people do it so automatically, because it is the most frequently used tactic against Christians, that they don't even realize they're doing something not only bad manners, but kind of silly. I want to say stupid, but parents tell their kids, you're not supposed to use the S word, stupid. So I'll just say dumb. They're doing something dumb when they do that, simply because it has nothing to do with the issue. And when they do that, that tips you off that they don't have an argument. They've got to attack you with the ad hominem. So that's one thing. Another tactic you mentioned that they use is a kind of a steamroller tactic, is what I call it. And I deal with that in the tactics book that I've written, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the steamroller is a person who just keeps interrupting and keeps coming back at you again and again and again with all these different things, and just overwhelms you with objections. And they do that a lot too. They can't stick on one thing. And the reason they can't stick on one thing and they keep interrupting when you're trying to answer one thing, then they interrupt with another thing, is because they're not interested in an answer. That cues you off that they're not interested in an answer. And sometimes you can even point that out in a nice way. And I've done that before, that people keep talking, rolling over you. And one guy said, okay. And I sat there quietly and let him talk, and then finally he stopped. And I said, okay, are we done? Okay, I'm going to go. They said, wait, you can't go. Why are you leaving? Well, you kept interrupting me so much. I realized you're not interested in hearing my answers. You just wanted to talk. So I said, okay, I'll let you talk. Now you're done talking. So the conversation's over. Now I did it in a nice way, but it did shame him a little bit because of the way he was acting and comporting himself. And he actually, apologized a little bit. Again, I wasn't nasty, but I was just holding his feet to the fire on what he was doing. When people hammer you with lots and lots of questions, it's fair to say, let's just deal with one question at a time. Is that all right with you? And then say, what would be the one thing right now that you would like me to try to address? And I'll do my best. And then you've narrowed it down to one thing. Same thing if there's a group of people, 4 or 5 people that are talking and bang, 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 bang. Okay, hold on, one at a time. I'm glad to do my best to answer, but no drive-by here, okay? Let's just have one at a time. Who's it going to be? Who wants to be first, And so you can then manage the circumstance somewhat. Even though maybe you don't have an answer to all the challenges, at least you're managing the conversation. But you do have to take control. You do have to be able to say, okay, hold on just a second. This is crazy. Let's just calm down. Let's relax. You want an answer? Would you like to hear my response? It's a question you can ask them. Yeah. Okay. Well, then you're going to have to give me an opportunity to respond. Would that be all right with you? So you negotiate a little bit. That's the steamroller tactic, and it's very effective. Works really well. Now, some people, you can't get them to cooperate, and that's the kind of person I just walk away from after they've done
bombard
their
you
say.
until.
Pardon me?
They're just going to keep bombarding you and not even let you talk.
Yeah. If they want to keep hammering, then I'm just going to say, look, it doesn't look like you're interested in listening, and that's okay if you don't want to do that. But I don't want to be part of a conversation like that. So why don't you just give me your last salvo here, fire your last shot, and I'll let you have the last word. And then they say their thing and say, okay, thank you. And then I'm done. I'm gone. I'm done. I'll move on to somebody else. And but I do it. Notice how I'm role playing it. I'm relaxed. I'm calm. I'm not intimidated by them. By the way, even though I may be inside a little intimidated by them, I'm comporting myself in a way that I'm not showing that. I'm just dealing with the problem, and I'm not going to let them push me around. All right. So that's an important detail here. Now, the ability to manage really tough situations like that comes with practice. But as a tactical maneuver, there is a way to manage the steamroller, and that's what I just described to you.
Are there any other big ones we should be aware of?
Well, the standard fallacies that I hear, the first one is the one I just described, the attack the person. Okay. The second, and then you brought up the one about overwhelming, but the other kind of informal fallacy is called a genetic fallacy. And you don't have to remember the words for your listeners. Maybe it's too fancy schmancy, but the key here is a genetic fallacy faults a view because of where it came from. Its genesis, its locus. So not on the merits of the view itself. So let's just say you're talking with a woman about abortion, and she's the pro-abortion person, and you're a guy, and you're the one who's arguing against abortion because it takes the life of an innocent human being. And she says, well, you're a man. Well, last time I checked, yes. So what? Well, men don't get abortions. Right. So what? Now, you know what she's trying to do. She's trying to dismiss my point of view because women get abortions, not men, as if that's relevant to the issue. But it's not relevant to the issue because my argument, the pro-lifers' argument, is that abortion kills an innocent human being. It doesn't matter the sex of the person who's objecting to killing a baby. It doesn't matter at all.
Truth is truth.
But they switch it around. A simple response, if you want to, like somebody offers that, a woman does. If I was beating my wife, here's what I'd ask. If you knew that I was beating my wife, would you object? Of course I would.
Yes.
Wait a minute, you're not married to her. I am.
Yeah.
So on the basis of what would you object? Because that ain't right to do to anyone. Exactly. And that's my same objection with regards to abortion. It doesn't matter, arguments don't have sex organs. But when people dismiss the argument based on, in this case, the gender, sex of the person giving it, that's irrelevant to whether the argument is a good one or a bad one. That's the genesis of the argument, the place it's coming from is irrelevant. So when somebody says you're a Christian because you were born in America, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, this is the atheist says that, right? You wouldn't be a Christian, you'd be a Muslim. Now that question has tripped up a lot of Christians. And they're thinking to themselves, man, he's got a point. If I wasn't raised here, I was raised there, I'd believe like that. Well, yeah, you probably would. And by the way, the atheist wouldn't be an atheist if he was raised in Saudi Arabia.
He'd be dead or believing just like them.
Yeah, exactly. He'd be believing just like them is what he'd be believing. So if it's sauce for the goose, it's sauce for the gander here. But it turns out it's not sauce for anybody because the psychological reasons or the cultural reasons that I might believe the religion I believe tells us nothing about whether the religion is true or false. You don't know anything about Christianity by that observation or about Islam for that matter. I mean, it could be that Buddhism is true or one or the other, Islam or Christianity. But this observation about what you would have done in a different circumstance is irrelevant. Notice that it is the genesis of the idea. You believe, your belief comes from your culture. It doesn't address whether the belief is true or not. And that's the only relevant question. So there's another very subtle approach that people use that trips up a lot of Christians, and they don't realize that it's a fallacy. And so if a person raises that issue to me, and he says, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, then you wouldn't be a Christian, you'd be a Muslim. I'm going to say, well, you're probably right. So what? Notice that so what is actually a question. I'm throwing it back. So what? Does that mean Christianity is false? Does that mean Islam is true? You can't get there from here.
Got no weight in the argument. Yeah.
Yes, right. And so when I throw the question back at them, they don't expect that. And now they're stuck because they can't answer that question because the answer is there is no so to it. So nothing. That's what it amounts to. But they have gotten away with this before because they've used it to stonewall Christians. And I think in their own mind, they think this is significant. It's not significant at all. Atheists will sometimes say, even Richard Dawkins has said this. He said, I just tell people, you're an atheist too, because you don't believe in a multitude, hundreds and hundreds of other gods. And I believe in one less God than you do. So you're basically an atheist. I mean, that's another, and I know people, I don't want to mention names because you would recognize this particular name, who was on TV and got busted with that thing and was speechless, didn't know how to respond. Now, my response is, I just believe in one less God than you. My response is going to be, yeah, that's what it means for you to be an atheist and mean not to be an atheist, for me to be a theist, because I believe in God and you don't. But this is kind of a silly line of thinking, isn't it? That's like saying I'm basically, I'm basically a bachelor because I'm not married
I date,
to
yeah,
6 billion other women on the planet. I'm only married to one, so I'm basically a bachelor. I mean, that's silly.
basically.
It's duh. My wife would be surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
It's just a silly point. But people get away with these silly points. Now, how do you deal with those silly points? Well, you got to recognize that they're silly and hopefully have kind of a comeback. So in these circumstances, I've actually thought through some of these issues. And the books that I write are meant to give some of the insight on these challenges and then offer the comeback so you're not stuck, flat-footed when people raise these silly arguments. You can ask an appropriate question to help them to see that this is not a good way to go. So that's a big part of what I do, and books that I write, what I do in my own podcasts, and traveling and speaking and stuff like that, Serge.
Okay, Greg. So it's time to put on the boxing gloves, and you can tell us how to be a tactical spy and how to.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about this, I think the boxing gloves is helpful in one way, because now we're going to get into what it looks like to get into these sparring matches. But at the same time, they're so gentle that people don't realize you got gloves on. So if people think about the clips that you showed of Lieutenant Columbo, who is my model in this, and I use him as a foil in a book that I've written called Tactics. And let me see if I got one handy here. Here it is right here. Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. Some people have the first edition. This red thing at the top there shows it's the 10th anniversary edition. But in that book,
we'll put a link in the description. So
okay, sounds good. In that book, what I do is I describe a game plan. There's lots of tactics in there, and I employed some of those in our discussion just a few moments ago. But to help people see where they've made mistakes in thinking. But in all of those, I have a core game plan that I call Columbo, after Lieutenant Columbo, who you featured at the beginning. And Lieutenant Columbo was a murder detective who would show up at the crime scene, and he's got this trench coat that you saw. He's usually carrying a cigar, and he's very, very non-threatening. It's like you can't take this guy seriously. He's walking around, scratching his head, muttering to himself, I don't know, there's something about this thing that bothers me. He's doing this number. Yeah, I got another question. One more thing, you mind if I... So you don't take him seriously. He doesn't seem like a threat. So from the perspective of the other person, there's no gloves on. Okay, so they're not defensive. They don't have the defenses up. There's these mild questions that Columbo keeps asking in order to get a little bit of information here, a little bit there. But as you watch the TV show, he's piecing these pieces together. And then towards the end, the questions that he begins asking are the ones that go right to the heart of the issue and nail the murderer, who you know who the murderer is from the very beginning of the show. So the murder is committed, the body's there, who did it. And then Columbo's got to figure it out. And he's asking these questions, and pretty soon you can see he's getting a pretty good idea of who this is. And then the answers that were given to the earlier questions, he's putting together to ask further questions that incriminate the actual murderer. And then he lowers the boom on him, and that's how the episode ends. Very, very clever. But the same technique is something we're using here. And we're asking certain questions that help us to move forward and gather different pieces of information for us. And it's these questions that allow us to be very relaxed in the environment and be able to face the most intimidating foes. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to be successful in every conversation. I mean, Serge, you know this. Sometimes you do well and sometimes you don't. And that depends on the Lord and the other person that you're talking to. And it does depend on us to some degree. But even when we do our best, that isn't going to guarantee anything. What I offer
That
with
staying
the
calm issue, that staying calm thing is really important because sometimes you get really mad and
right.
you just want to explode and
Well, I have
you
a
don't
rule
go where you
about
want to
that.
go.
If anybody gets mad, I lose. That's my rule. If anybody gets mad, if I get mad, I'm not going to win. I'm not going to have an impact, is my point. If I don't get mad, but they get mad, I'm not going to have an impact. Now, we can't always control whether they get mad, but it helps.
There's a Spanish saying to that, el que
Yeah,
se
what is it?
agüita pierde.
Say it again.
It goes, el que se agüita pierde. And everybody says it means the one that gets mad is the one who loses.
Oh, okay. I remember that. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So if we discipline ourselves to be calm, that helps. Now, one of the things that helps us to be calm, though, is when we can manage the conversation. We can be in the driver's seat. So how do you say in the driver's seat? It's very simple, okay? And our conversation here is a good example, okay? Who's doing the most of the talking here, you or me?
You are.
Yeah. But who's in the driver's seat of this conversation, you or me?
I guess I would be.
Yes, you are. And how is it that you're directing the conversation?
The questions.
Exactly. Bingo. There it is. The person who's asking the questions is the one who's in control. Not doing most of the talking, probably, but directing the conversation. You're directing the entire interview based on the questions you're asking me. Same principles in play here when we're talking with other people. We are asking certain questions that will direct it. Now, what's nice about this game plan is there's only 3 parts to it. And the first 2 are really simple. The third is a little bit more complex, but the first 2 are really simple. And I have 2 model questions for the first 2 parts of the game plan. And even when people are just doing the simple parts, which doesn't require you to know hardly anything, you can still have a tremendous impact on people, even though you don't do the third level, which is more advanced. Now, the first step of the game plan, and I want people to get this clearly because I don't want people, when they are under attack by a non-Christian, to think so much, or even maybe initiating a conversation with someone that they'd like to have a spiritual impact on. I don't want them to think so much about winning that person to Christ or even answering the challenge. Maybe they're not capable of answering the challenge. I want them to think about something else first and second. Okay. The first thing I want them to do is I want them to gather information. It's all I want them to do. And you gather information with some form of the question, what do you mean by that? Okay. So let's say somebody comes up to you and says, well, the Bible's been changed, or the Bible's been corrupted. And that's what, as the Muslims would say. And so the question then is, instead of like, oh no, I don't know how to deal with this, I'm lost. Sure, you can deal with it. Here's what you say. Just like you said, Serge, what do you mean the Bible's been changed? So it's what do you mean by that is the model, and you just adapt it to the circumstances. What do you mean the Bible's been changed? Now, they may have an idea of how the manuscripts got handed down, and maybe people made mistakes, or they'll come up with a telephone game or something like that as a way of describing what they think happened. Okay, fine. Let them do that. Now, the reason is twofold. One of them is so that we can understand their view, the nature of their objection. The more they talk about it, the more detail they give, the better that we'll understand it. But I want them to understand their own objection, because a lot of people are going to say, well, the Bible's been changed. And you say, well, what do you mean it's been changed? What do you think happened? Did you notice that? That was called dead air, which dead air is not good for radio or for podcasts. It's just like, nothing, but that's what you get from the person that you're asking, what do you mean by the thing you just said? And sometimes they just repeat themselves. They'll say, well, I mean, the Bible's been changed. No, I heard you the first time. In what sense? Describe what you think happened. They can't do that because they've never thought about it. Or maybe they'll take some weak shots at it. Some people might know more, fine. But a lot of times people aren't going to be able to answer that in a substantive way. Okay, but maybe they can. Maybe there's giving all this information, and then you have a second question you want to ask them. The first time you're just gathering information about their view. The second question is, now you know what they believe happened. Now you want to know why they believe that. It's a different question. How did you come to that conclusion? How did you come to that conclusion? So let's say the Bible's been changed. What do you mean it's been changed? What do you think happened? Blah, 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 blah. Maybe they'll tell you something. Good. Okay, now I know what you think happened. Why do you think that actually did happen? What are your reasons to think that what you just described did take place? So that's a different kind of question. And that's the burden of proof question. So we're making them argue for their view instead of having us argue against the view. And that's why these first two steps can be taken by anyone, even a complete novice, even a fairly brand new Christian who doesn't know any apologetics. They can be a student of the other person's view. And I'm just going to make a statement here, Sergio, that a lot of people aren't going to believe until they've done it. But if you just are a student of the other person's view, both what it is and why they believe it, and you're not making any attempts to refute it, you are going to make progress, and God is going to do things in them when they realize maybe they can't explain their view very well. So let me give you an example of that. Just the first question. Okay. So I was at an event a number of years ago, and this was a Christian event, and there was a lot of Christians there, and they came up to the table, and this man, gentleman, came up and he told me that with regards to the abortion issue, he was personally against abortion. He was pro-life. But he said, I don't think we should be forcing our views on other people. I mean, that's their decision. It's not ours. Now, many will recognize this view because politicians use it all the time. And it's called the modified pro-choice position. Okay, fine. There's a big problem with it, though. And I knew the problem, but I was able to help this man see the problem by just taking the first step of the game plan. Because I had to ask a clarification question of him about his view. So you think abortion is wrong? I asked him. He said, yes, I do. I said, why? That was the question. Why? Why do you think it's wrong? And he said, well, I think abortion kills a baby. To put it simply, abortion kills a baby. That's my view. But I don't think we should be forcing that on other people. That's my personal view. And so I said to him, okay, all I'm going to do, let me just repeat back what I heard. And you tell me what you think of it. You actually do believe that abortion kills an innocent child. And you also think that parents ought to be allowed to do that to their own children. And he said, well, when you put it that way, I said, put it what way? That's your view. Now, if I misunderstood your view, correct me. Maybe I did. But isn't that your view? And so he was stuck. Now, I don't know whatever became of him, but I gave him enough for him to have good reason to change his view. Whether he changes his view or not, that's between him and God. But I gave him enough to do it. And now anybody listening to the show knows that if somebody comes up to them and says, well, I'm against abortion, but I don't think we should be forcing our views on other people, then you ask them, why are you against abortion? And if it's for the same reason this man said, then you can repeat what I just repeated. You actually think abortion kills a baby? And you think it's okay for other people to do that? You think it's okay for your neighbors to kill their kids? Is that what you're telling me?
Oh, yeah.
But it is what he's telling you. Yeah. It actually is. But notice,
I held that view myself for many, many years as well.
Huh.
Like I was totally against it, but I did believe that it's not my body. I'm not the person carrying it. So how can I really tell them?
Yeah, it's also not your wife if I'm beating mine. Yeah. You know, in other words, that's how kind of a silly thing. So why object to what somebody else beats you? You want to marry her? Yeah. If you want to marry her, then you know, whatever. So, but that just shows how ridiculous that view is. But people don't see it when those kinds of bad arguments are used to justify some popular notions that people have strong feelings about. But when you take the same argument and apply it to something else, and by the way, that's a tactic called taking the roof off that's in the book, and you apply it to something else, use the same line of thinking, you see how bad it is. And this is essentially what I was doing with with the guy. The reason I bring that illustration up, and I have more anecdotes I could give you, but I'm bringing that particular illustration up to show how just one question, a clarification question, can stop a person in their tracks, like it did with him. And now in this case, though, I was aware of the problem. And so I was asking the question for a reason. So even though I was just getting more information, Columbo number 1, the first step, I was actually also using my questions for Columbo number 3, which is using my questions to make a point. So that's more the advanced stage. You're using your question to make a point. So you have a point in view, and you're using questions to get there. But that's a more complex process. I have another book called Street Smarts where I go into a lot of detail about that, and I'll hold up a bunch of different issues, although the basic maneuver is in the tactics book itself. But it's more advanced, and you have to know what's wrong with the other person's view in order to ask questions to expose that. But I do that all the time. So here's another example of that with regards to the problem of evil. So an atheist will say, look at all the evil in the world. How can there be a God when there's so much evil? There's different aspects to this question, but the one that I focus in on, at least initially, especially since the atheist thinks that evil in the world is evidence against God. Okay, this is a mistake that he's making, and I know it's a mistake. So I am going to ask some questions to get more clarification, and then to, in a certain sense, lower the boom on him. Okay. And so it'll become obvious in these series of questions that I'll offer. So he makes this statement. How can there be, I don't believe in God. Why? All this evil in the world. And I tell him, first of all, I say, well, you know what? I'm sympathetic. I understand how you can think that way. But when you say there's evil in the world, what is it you're talking about? And that's a clarification question, number 1. And he said, well, you know, like murder and theft and genocide and sexual trafficking and on and on and on. Okay, great. Yeah, I think those are evil too. But let's just say there is no God. Maybe you're right. There is no God. Let me ask you this. Do those things still happen that you just described? Of course they do. Are those things still evil? There's no God now. Are they still evil? Yes, exactly. Of course they are. That's why I don't believe in God. Okay, here's my final question. Now, pause for a moment. Now I'm going into Columbo number 3. I have all my ducks in a row here, and most of the people listening don't know where I'm going to go next. Some of your listeners may know, but most won't. But you're going to see it immediately. Okay, so all those things happen, atheist, yes, and they're still evil, right? Okay, now you tell me, in a universe without God, in a universe that is just molecules in motion, that's your view as an atheist, where are you getting your moral standard from that you are judging all these things as evil? Okay, notice the little pause there and this dead air. That's what you get, is dead air. They might say, well, it's obvious that it's evil. No, I'm not asking you how you know it. I'm asking you where the law comes from. I mean, you could know what the speed limit is by looking out at the speed limit sign on your street out in front. But that isn't where the speed limit comes from. It doesn't come from that sign. It comes from the government who put the sign there. I want to know where you're making all these judgments. You're saying that rape is evil. You're saying that genocide is evil and sexual trafficking is evil and on down the line. Okay.
Nothing's evil if there's nothing there to tell you it's evil.
Exactly. If there are no laws, then how could there be broken laws? So just as an illustration, do you know that superhighway there in Germany called the Autobahn?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Can you break the speed limit on the Autobahn?
I don't think there is a speed limit.
There's no speed limit.
Yeah.
So you can't break
I think the only law about this Autobahn is you have to have new tires. If you go on there and your tire pops, you're
yeah.
You have to
I didn't know about that. But the point is that there's no speed limit on the Autobahn, and so you can't be stopped for speeding if there's no speed limit. All right, maybe for bad tires, but not for speed limits. And so if there is no government to make any speed limits for the universe, then there can't be any speed limits, therefore no broken speed limits, therefore no evil. If you say there's evil, you're saying there are broken speed limits. And so I'm asking, where's those speed limits coming from? If there's no government from which they come, they can't exist, and therefore there can't be evil. Now, maybe I went a little fast for folks. They can rewind and, listen to that again. But the point is that in order to have laws that are broken, you have to have a lawmaker. An atheist doesn't believe in a lawmaker on a universal scale, and therefore there can't be laws that are broken that are called evil. The fact that he's complaining about a real problem of evil turns out to be evidence for the existence of God. Okay, so that's the backstory of the argument, but you saw how I played that out with him through a series of questions. So I opened up with some clarification questions and got all the information I needed from him.
That's the first step, right?
That was my first step, to get all those pieces on the table that he would put there. And then with all that sitting there, now I ask the relevant, appropriate question.
That's tactic
I'm
two,
not
right?
bullying him. I'm just asking a question of common sense coherence. This doesn't make sense the way you're characterizing it. If there is real evil in the world, there's got to be real moral laws. There's got to be a real moral lawmaker. So you have one of two choices at this. You've got to you abandon. You can stay an atheist, but you've got to get rid of any notion that there's evil in the world, because that doesn't make any sense in the world that you think actually exists. Or you can acknowledge there's evil in the world, but then you got to get rid of your atheism, because atheism can't make any sense of this. My view, our view, makes sense of evil in the world. Now, that doesn't answer the bigger question, why would God allow it? That's a different question. But I am making the point with the atheist that you can't, it's not even a legitimate question, the question about evil, if there isn't a God that sets the standards for what's good and evil to begin with. So what I've offered there is just an example, a very practical example of how I would maneuver in a conversation with someone who, holds that there is no God, but then wants to complain about the problem of evil. Okay, so but notice how I can, since I know where I'm going with this, remember this is kind of an advanced application of tactics. I know how to undo his view, show the flaw in his view, and I know the questions to ask to do it. I can be very relaxed. Now, what if you don't know that, all that stuff? Yeah. The guy says, well, how could there be all this evil in the world if there's a God? You can say, well, that's a fair question, and I'm still working on it. That's all you have to say. You don't have to feel like you're cornered, or you're either then atheism must be true. Just because
I lost the argument, Christianity must not be true then.
Yeah, exactly. But then there are always going to be questions or issues that you can't deal with. I was in a very long podcast 2 months ago. I'm not sure if I mentioned this or not, but with Alex O'Connor, who is a very well-known atheist, and he's only 26 years old. He's really impressive. You do not trifle with Alex O'Connor. He's what, Oxford or Cambridge educated in philosophy and theology, and he's very, very cool, under fire. He's got very good challenges, but he is not a moral objectivist. He's a moral relativist, and he doesn't believe in objective morality. So he's not going to raise the problem of evil against Christians because he doesn't believe in evil. Okay, but he does raise the problem of suffering. So what about all the suffering of human beings and animals, even if the fall of man, according to you, Christian, is the cause of human suffering and human death and all that? Even before the fall, there was, on his view at least, and I know there's debate about this among Christians, but there's still thousands or maybe millions of years of animal suffering before the fall of man. So how do you make sense of that? Okay. Now, there's lots of things that was going on there and a lot of elements to that challenge that could be addressed. But one of the things I pointed out is that even though he's denying the existence of objective morality, and therefore he's not complaining about the problem of evil, when he complains about the problem of suffering, he's implying that there's something morally questionable about suffering. So he's kind of smuggling morality in here into the suffering question. Now, when I
There
accused him
should
of
be
that, when
nothing
I
wrong with
pointed that
things
out,
dying then.
sorry,
If there's no morality, there should be no problem with anything dying.
yeah, or suffering, or who?
Yeah.
So what? You know
I
what's wrong
personally
with that?
myself, I do believe in a young Earth, so I do believe nothing died before
Yeah,
Adam.
okay, fair enough. Fair enough. But he doesn't, and a lot of Christians don't believe in a young earth. But so it becomes a substantive challenge, or even the challenge after the fall, you still have all this animal suffering. And so the question is, even if there's no evil in the world, which we would deny that there is evil in the world, our whole story is about the problem of evil from chapter 3 all the way to the end of the book, 66 books later, is solving the problem of evil. So even so, we're still faced with animal and human suffering afterwards. And he would think that that's a problem for you. But it's only a problem for us coming from him is if there is a moral consequence to suffering. And since he doesn't believe in morality, he has no right to ask that kind of question. From his worldview, that question doesn't work. If you catch my view, just like complaining about evil in the world if you're an atheist. So he wasn't complaining about evil, but he was smuggling evil into the suffering, and therefore he can't help himself to that objection against Christianity. Now, more could be said about that, and I did say more, but I just want your listeners to be able to see how sometimes the tendency to think in moral terms is so ingrained in human beings that even when we deny morality, it still shows up in our language somewhere. And that's because we're made in the image of God. I call this the inside out technique.
I've written my commandments on their heart.
Yes, that's right. And I have there's a tactic that trades on this. It's called inside out. In other words, there are things that God has already built on the inside, commandments in the heart, as you mentioned, that are true even for the atheist because they're there. And even if he denies God and denies morality, his understanding of right and wrong, objective right and wrong, is going to come out. It's going to manifest itself, even when he's trying not to, even when he's trying to deny it. And that's one of the things we watch for. And it's almost like one of the clips from Columbo when your atheist friend who denies objective morality is talking about something, raising an issue that entails objective morality, like the suffering concern that Alex raised. That's when I'm going to kind of scratch my head away, and I'm confused about something here. I got another question because I'm confused about what you just said. And then you offer the question. I'm confused because you're an atheist, right? You don't believe morality. Then what's the problem with suffering? Well, suffering's bad. Well, when you say bad, what do you mean? Do you mean you don't like it? Oh, okay. Well, then that's all you mean is you don't like it. So what? I don't like Brussels sprouts. Right? That doesn't mean, God doesn't exist just because I don't like Brussels sprouts. So you see how that works out there.
Yeah.
So those are the steps of the basic steps of the game plan, which I call Columbo. Basically 3 steps. First, you gather information with some form of the question, what do you mean by that? Anybody can do that. You may not get any further in a conversation of a challenger. Just get clarification on their objection. So you have become a student of their objection. That's it. Is that a plus? Sure. Now you've got more information about what people object to, even if you can't answer it. If you get to the second point, now how did you come to that conclusion? You reverse the burden of proof. Now you're going to find out not only what they believe, but why they believe it, if they have a good reason, which a lot of times they're not going to have a good reason. But at least you get more education. If you know nothing, you could still ask that question, and that just takes you another step as being a student of their belief. And then if you know what's wrong with their view, you can point it out, but also using questions. That's the third step, using questions to make a point. So just to give you some insight on the effectiveness, we were doing a conference, or I was doing a teaching at the University of Minnesota, right across the street at a church there in Minneapolis. And after all morning and early afternoon of the training and stuff, now we're sending you out on campus with a questionnaire to talk to students. And some of the students that I had, in our class were mortified at that. Oh no. One woman came back and she said, when you told us that we were going to go out on campus to talk to students, here's what she said. She said, I feared doing that more than I feared having another child. More than I feared childbirth. That's what she said. But when she got back,
Is this before or after Charlie Kirk?
No, this is way before Charlie Kirk. But what she feared wasn't for her life. She just feared the engagement. Talking to college students. What am I going to do? Well, we've just been training her what to do. She had the tools, but she was still spooked out, right? So, but she was saying this after they got back, because we had a debrief after they got back. And in the debrief, she's saying, when you said we're going to do this, I feared that more than childbirth. But I learned two things. Here's what she said. I learned two things. First of all, people aren't as scary as I thought they were. In other words, once you start talking with them in a friendly manner, people are friendly back. They're not nasty and mean, characteristically. You ask them if they want to answer some spiritual questions based on your questionnaire, and off you go. And if they say no, they're gone. If they say yes, they're interested. They're interested at least to give you a point of view. Well, that's great. That's friendly. So they weren't as scary as I thought. That's the first thing she said. Here's the second thing she said. They weren't as smart as I thought either. Oh my goodness. She thought all these students were going to be so far beyond her, so intelligent, have these great objections. She wouldn't know how to deal with them, which, by the way, if that's the case, that's all right. If you're a Christian, don't know how to deal. At least you're knowing what people object to. That's an education for you. You can come back the next time, with more information. But the key thing is that she realized, that they were like giants in her sight, but they didn't have much substance. They didn't have much substance. And boy, I find this all the time. Very intelligent people make very foolish mistakes in thinking when it comes to spiritual things. They and pardon me for saying this, but they say the dumbest things. They say dumb stuff. And if you're listening and you know what to look for, sometimes you realize, now that's really dumb. Now you don't say that to them, but you can ask questions then about it, and then they end up not being able to answer because there's nothing to say. It was a dumb idea, kind of thing.
Wow. So in your decades of I'm not trying to date you, but
that's right. I'm dated already. 1950 is when I was born. Halfway through the last millennium.
Yeah. So
or the last 100 years, I should say.
Go ahead. All your time doing apologetics and having your radio show and having people call in, and what are a few of the toughest questions you've had to answer?
Well, a couple come to mind. Most I'm trying to think how best to qualify this. The hardest questions are the theological questions and not in a sense, the apologetics questions. So the theological questions say of sovereignty and free will. I believe in God's sovereignty and I believe in man's freedom. But at the same time, the question is, well, how does that all work together? How can human beings make genuinely free choices and God still accomplish exactly what he wants to accomplish according to his divine decree? In some sense, he's got it all worked out, planned out. He's got the long shot, and this doesn't matter whether you're Calvinist or Arminian. I mean, everybody agrees to the sovereignty of God. So how does that all work out? I think that's really hard to unwrap, and you can kind of get closer sometimes, but that's a problem. It's not a problem. It's a conundrum is what I mean. But when it comes to challenges directly to our faith, our convictions about Christ, the ones right now that are harder to deal with, and I don't mean that they are unresolvable. I mean that they are more challenging. They take more time. They require more insight, especially in one case in the Old Testament culture and the ancient Near Eastern culture, and also in the wording and what the words mean in the original language. And the one about slavery in the Old Testament. Well, the word slave comes from the Hebrew word avad. It's EBER is the way it's spelled in English, but I think it's pronounced avad. Turns out that avad is the exact same word for a servant. So Moses was an avad of God, a servant of God, but he had avads, slaves. Why did they switch it there in the translation? And actually, in the King James translation, there's almost every single case where the word avad shows up, they translate it servant. But since the beginning of the 20th century, the translations began to switch. Avad now is slave. And when people see the word slave,
So in the
they
King
think
James, it's servant.
it's servant. Almost every single occasion of it is servant. But when I have my Young's Concordance here, that's key to the King James. But when it comes to the newer ones, they keep translating avad slave, 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 slave. And this creates a false impression in the Old Testament. And that is that the slavery that is being, quote unquote, slavery that's being described is most often indentured servanthood. They're getting a job according to the customs of the day, but it looks like chattel slavery like we had in the United States for so long. That's what people picture, and they think this is bizarre. And then it says a man can sell his daughter as a slave. Oh man, a guy can sell his daughter as a slave. What kind of God is that? And that's what they think of. He's getting money to put her in a cotton field somewhere, No, all he's doing is getting her a job. Because when women, they're growing up, they got to be taken care of in that culture. And if they're thrown out, well, there's not much for them to do with prostitution. So her dad is arranging for her to indenture herself with another employer who pays for all her, her lodging and her food and takes care of her in exchange for service. Okay, that took me a while to explain, right? Most people aren't going to sit still for that. And so that's a harder issue. And the same thing with the so-called genocide, the destruction of the Canaanites by the Hebrews, that was commanded by God. This is also a harder one to deal with. It can be dealt with.
Yeah. How do you justify murdering children and women and stuff like that, like it says in there?
Yeah. So that's a little harder one because of our modern sensibilities. But this, what's interesting to me, Serge, is that when people raise that issue, nobody ever complains about the flood. The flood killed everybody, but 8. Only 8 people were in the boat. Killed all the animals too, except for those in the ark. And so what about all men, women, and children that were all destroyed? They don't raise that issue. But the question is, does God have a right to give life or to take it away? And the answer is yes. God can take life whenever he wants. It belongs to him. And usually he has a pretty good reason for doing it. And that's what's a little bit more difficult to unpack on that issue. So that, I think, is one of the harder issues, or those two, but have to do with ancient Near Eastern culture and other particulars that people have to have the patience to listen to. And they have to have a charitable attitude, a willingness to consider an alternative that maybe they hadn't thought of that might help them to see that the behaviors that are recorded there are morally justified. Okay. And by the way, what's the alternative? That's another question that can be asked, because if they're going to go to atheism, oh, you're welcome to that. But
doesn't matter who he killed.
Yeah, it doesn't matter who anybody kills. You want slavery, you want sexual slavery, you want chattel slavery. None of that's wrong. Yeah, the strong rule the weak. There you go. That's evolution. So the other issue has to do with the problem of evil, and it's the broader question of why would God, if he's a good, powerful God, why would it allow evil in the world? Okay. Now, I think the issue of evil in the world and God, there are 2 elements to it. And one is the first one we already covered. If there is evil in the world, then there is a God. And that there is no way out of that. And I've got philosophy books behind me and talk to people, and I know all the angles, know all the maneuvers, and none of them are going to work. They're not even coming close to work. They're not even, in the running to helping us have a clear understanding about how there could be a problem of evil if there is no God. Evil is evidence for God. That's the moral argument for God. It's my favorite argument, by the way. And there's a bunch of ways to argue for the existence of God. This one is my favorite because it trades and leverages on the problem of evil, which everybody knows about. Okay, so what's not available to us if we're going to really acknowledge evil in the world is that evil is an argument against God. It's for God. So now what you have with evil in the world and God is you ask the question, well, why would God do that? Now, we're not asking why to be able to, if we don't get an answer, then we're going to get rid of God. Because if we don't have God, then we don't have a problem to begin with. We already covered that ground. We're trying to understand maybe God. Now, the liability, and this is why this is a hard question, Sergio, is that the liability of any what or I should say why question, why did God or why didn't God? Any question that starts out like that is almost impossible for us to answer with any confidence because they are based on something that is true in the mind of God. But he hasn't told us what that is. And if he hasn't told us, all we can do is conjecture. Why did God do this? Why did he do that? Why didn't he do it different? To which I respond, I'll tell you, I don't know. Because God hasn't told me and he hasn't told anybody. Okay. However, that doesn't mean we can't, in a reflective way, come up with some options. And coming up with the options to answer the question of why God allowed evil, there's a name that is used to describe those kinds of reflections, and that's called theodicy. Theodicy. Somebody might have heard that term before. So theodicies are explanations about why God might have allowed evil. And I offer a theodicy in another book I wrote called The Story of Reality. And this is just from the beginning to the end, how the world began, how it ends, and everything important that happens in between. And one of the things I have to talk about in the beginning is the fall of man and why there's evil in the world. So I describe some of those things, how it happened, and then reflect on, well, why would God have allowed this kind of thing? Why would he have let this happen? Couldn't he have done differently? Yeah, well, he could have done differently. But so here's a thought about that. It's something that people can chew on. There's a number of different lines of discussion that people have offered, but here's one of them. God wants us to enter heaven with virtues that we develop here on earth. He wants us to enter heaven with virtues that we develop here on earth. Now, this seems to be pretty obvious from something that Paul said in 1 Timothy chapter 4. And what he says is that bodily exercise, pumping iron, he said that has a little profit. But godliness, by contrast, is a means of great gain, for it holds a promise not only for this life. In other words, if you are sanctified into godliness, that benefits you now, but also for the life to come. So the godliness we develop in this life bears fruit in the next life. Now, what the heck is that all about? It's hard to figure that out, but Paul is saying it. So what it looks like in heaven and all that, I'm not sure. We can conjecture on that, but nevertheless, he's saying it. So what does godliness look like? Well, think of virtues. Patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. These are fruits of the Spirit. Long-suffering, forgiveness, persevering under hardship. These are all virtues that we develop. Do you notice that none of those things that I mentioned can be developed in a world where there is no sin, where there is no evil? So it's like long suffering. We can only have long suffering in a place where we have to suffer to some degree, and that builds a virtue in us. The ability to be forgiving, 70 times 7, is only if there's something to be forgiven that people have done against us. Charity is showing kindness to the poor, where there's got to be poverty before we can show kindness to the poor. What I'm saying is, it makes sense that God, if his desire is for us in this world to grow in virtue, and it will benefit us in the long run, that the world has to have flaws and faults and evil in it for us to grow robustly in virtue. And if there's no flaws or no evil in the world, then we're not going to grow in that.
You know what I find so beautiful about that view is that it said that as we go through our stuff, as we become sanctified, that the angels are watching and learning about salvation and sanctification, because it's something they cannot go through.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's something, it's not only the angels watching, I think the saints are watching too. And Hebrews chapter 12 talks about that. This great cloud of witnesses, having just described them in Hebrews 11, now it talks about the great cloud of witnesses who are watching as we run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes, on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. So this is a harder issue. And what I just described to you is characteristically called soul making. God allows evil because he uses it in soul making, helping our souls to grow in virtue. And that's a very likely scenario, but it's certainly not the only thing, that the only reason that God has allowed evil in the world. There's other conjectures, but we don't know for sure all of the reasons. And likely when we get to be with him, we'll have a fuller picture of that. For now, we have to trust him, that he knows what he's doing. And it's clear, by the way, that the suffering of this age that we experience as Christians is redeemed for good in the future. And I think of two places that it speaks of that specifically. One is in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the last couple of verses. And this is where Paul uses this phrase, weight of glory, that C.S. Lewis wrote this wonderful essay about, or he titled it that. And Paul says, for momentary light affliction, when he talks about momentary and light affliction, he's comparing it to eternity. In this life, it doesn't feel momentary and it doesn't feel light. I mean, this guy was whipped 4 times, 39 lashes. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was twice shipwrecked. He was stoned once in Lystra. So this guy had it rough.
Bitten by venomous snakes.
Yeah, that's right. He shook that one off and got out of that one alive. But these other ones, I mean, to just get thrashed a couple of times, man. This guy had 39 strokes 4 different times. Anyway, I
find it funny how those guys were like, "Oh my God, that guy just went through that whole shipwreck just to be bitten by a snake, and now he's gonna die."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Right, exactly. So, but he says momentary light affliction, and the verb here is really important, is producing for us an eternal weight of glory. So it's the affliction, far beyond all comparison, he says. So it's the afflictions and stuff that we experience that God allows us, the bad stuff that are the route towards to the good stuff. And without the bad stuff, we don't get the good stuff, is producing for us. And then in Romans chapter 8, he says, I do not consider the sufferings of this life to bear any comparison to the glory that is to come. So there you have 2 little scriptural vignettes that allows you to see a little, like through the telescope into eternity a little bit, how God is going to stack this up for us. And that all relates to the reason why he's allowed evil in the world.
Yeah, I was hearing another podcast on the way home from work, and the guy had been going as a missionary, and he went to Haiti after that big earthquake or whatever, and he was really going through it, I guess malaria and all kinds of stuff. And there was a guy that was saying he hears from God, and he wanted to talk to him, like, oh, finally, I'm getting a word from God. And the guy comes to him and tells him, God told me to tell you you're about to go through your toughest season.
So thanks a lot. Yeah.
But out of it, your real ministry is going to come out of it. So,
yeah. Well, you know what? I think that many of your listeners who have been around the Lord for a while, certainly more than 10 years, they're going to look back on their life and see that the greatest growth came for them spiritually through the toughest times that God allowed them to go through. This is a universal truth. And for those people, no, do some people go through rough times and they lose their faith? Sure. I'm not sure what faith they lost, though. And I mean this really genuinely. I'm not condescending on these people. I'm just saying, well, I didn't have much of a faith if they're going to lose. I'm wondering about the legitimacy or the authenticity of their faith. If they are truly born again and not just kind of along for the ride, for the good stuff, and then things get hard. Jesus talked about the plants. Some had a root, some didn't, or the building built on the sand instead of built on the rock. And well, some people's don't have a genuine faith. They have a religion that they call Christianity, but they are not connected properly to God through faith, through a genuine faith in Christ. But for those who are genuinely regenerate, I don't think they're going to go that route. I think because they're regenerate, they're going to hang in there. And then they're going to look back at the hard times and say, yeah, I needed that. That was really hard. I don't want to go through it again, but I'm glad that I did, because coming out the other end, I'm more the kind of person, not only God wants me to be, but I'm more the kind of person I want to be. And that's soul making, like we were talking about, Serge.
Well, I think you can really tell someone who is a believer, because they're going through turmoil and they do it with a smile. There's still joy in their heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's often the case. It's not always the case. I'm just thinking of my own life. Sometimes it just gets brutal, and that's why you weep with those who weep, and you cry with those who cry, or whatever. We encourage one another through those times. But sometimes, like you pointed out, there is just an amazing joy and strength that's beyond us, that helps us to maneuver and to navigate even the toughest things that life has to throw our way.
Well, Greg, I want to be very respectful with your time, but I do have some questions that I want to see your perspective on. Is it okay if I ask you a few of them?
Yeah, I'm looking at almost hour and 45 minutes so far. I do have some things that I have to do today, but if you want to give me your best shot, let's deal with that, and then we'll call it maybe another time we could have it again.
Okay. This is a question I actually got from somebody in a debating page. He said, if God is outside of time and space and eternal, wouldn't that mean he can never change? And if he can never change, how can he create something new?
Okay, so this is a really good question, and there's a mixed. The court is out really with the Christian philosophers on whether God is outside of time or not. I don't think he's outside of time. I think he is participating in a temporal way. There's temporal. He is participating as things are happening. Okay, because time is what keeps everything from happening at once. Right. If I have I'm just going to hold up Tactics here for one to just flash the cover again. But let's just say this is a novel. And I have some novels here somewhere, but let's just say it's a novel. Well, in a novel, you don't have any now. There's no now moments in a novel. There are things that happen after other things in sequence, but not things that actually happen later or earlier, just before and after in sequence, because it's all happening at once in the novel, right? And some people think of time that way. That's actually the way C.S. Lewis described it. But I think he's mistaken. I think there is a now, and we're experiencing now. We're experiencing now. And the now we were just experiencing 4 seconds ago is in our past. And now we have a new now, and the next now is in our future. So notice we have a movement of time. God is also participating in that. All right. So God, on my view, God is temporal. By the way, the scripture doesn't require that God be atemporal. It just requires that he has no beginning and no end. That's all that's required. And it's likely that he was atemporal until creation. In other words, nothing was happening. Certainly God doesn't change. That's classic Christian theology. James says that there's no variation or shifting of shadows. There's no change in God. He's the same at the beginning, at the end. That's why we can count on him. He doesn't have a bad hair day, and he's not like count on him one day, but then he's gonna be all different the next day. No, he is solid and reliable. And that's why his promises are good, because he can't lie, can't change. There he is. All right. So now if he was like that, I mean, that is God's unchangeable character. He's immutable is the word that's used to describe it. But that doesn't mean he can't do anything. God can be personally in a sense on the inside unchanging, but things can be changing around him. He can cause things to take place. That doesn't threaten his immutability. And the atheist guy's just confused on that point. If God is immutable, he still can act. And whether or not he acts temporally or atemporally is a matter of discussion, but both are could be argued are consistent with God's character. And both are possible given Scripture. Now, I think that God is temporal because of the way Scripture describes him. He creates on the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day. Well, I think that's talking about a sequence that's true even for him. And then he makes a promise to Adam. Then he raises up. To Abraham. Then he raises up the nation of Israel. Then he becomes incarnate, adds a human nature to himself when the Word becomes flesh. That happens in time according to God. Also, these things are all happening for him. Now, this isn't putting him in a box. It's like taking him out of a box, because if there's no temporality to God's behaviors, then he can't have any behaviors. Think of this. If God creates on the first day what the Scripture says, and then what's that word then? And then creates something different on the second day, what he created in the first day is in the past to him. That was yesterday, even to God. Now, if it's not yesterday to you, even to God, then when is this happening? It's all happening at once. But that isn't the way the Scripture describes it. Then it's more like a book. He just makes the whole book. But even if he makes the whole book at once, there was when for God. He hadn't made the book, and now he makes the book, so he's still temporal. Mm-hmm. So I would argue with the atheist, first of all, that God is temporal. That allows him to act in history, takes him out of the box, as it were, and that doesn't affect his immutability at all. How does it affect his immutability? That would be a question I'd ask them. How is it that if God acts to create, that he's no longer immutable? What changed inside of God? Well, he might say, well, God changed his mind. How did he change his mind? Well, he wasn't going to act, and then he does act. Well, you're assuming that he wasn't going to. But what if God is in his entire range of knowledge always knew that at some point he would initiate an act of creation? And that point came and he did it. How is that God being mutable? See, I don't think that challenge is going to survive with the questions that I'm asking him. So that's the way I would push back on that particular point. Does that make sense to you, Serge?
Yeah.
It's a little bit more kind of philosophically sophisticated, but there you go. We got a little bit of everything here.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for taking us through your Colombo Academy of Tactics. And I guess we're all deputized gumshoes now.
You go.
Thank you so much. Would you mind praying us out?
No, I'd be glad to. Lord, I'm really thankful that you gave me an opportunity to be here with Serge and with his entire audience. I'm thankful for what he's doing, encouraging, building, and training the body of Christ through his listeners. I thank you for his faithfulness to accomplish this and to see the kingdom advance through his efforts, Lord. I pray for all of the people that have been listening. I know we talked about a lot of stuff, but the basic game plan that allows them to begin engaging in a safe way with questions, it's pretty simple. I pray, Father, that they would begin using these questions like, what do you mean by that? And how did you come to that conclusion? Even if they don't go any further, and that would be a basis or a foundation for their developing a tactical approach with grace, with kindness, being nice to people, but in the process being effective for the gospel's sake, Lord. Grant them kingdom effectiveness through all that we talked about today and all that Sergio continues to invest in them for Christ's sake and for the kingdom's sake. Amen.
Amen and amen. Thanks again, Greg. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time for the next episode of Grotto and Tarp.
Welcome to the grotto. Welcome to the grotto. Welcome to the grotto.